Hello, I'm Tom Snelling. I'm an epidemiologist and a clinical trialist in the Sydney School of Public Health. And today I'm going to provide a brief introduction to the use of adaptive trial methods. We're going to cover why we need more efficient clinical trials, what adaptive trials are, what are platform trials, the use of adaptive features in trial design, including response adaptive randomization and Bayesian borrowing, and suggestions for how to implement these adaptive features in clinical trials. The first important point to make is that the costs of running clinical trials is increasing. Just as other areas of expenditure in healthcare, the cost of running a clinical trial can be extremely expensive. And this has led to a desire to design clinical trials in a much more efficient way than how we have traditionally designed and implemented them. It's estimated that in the UK, almost all publicly funded clinical trials are traditional parallel group designs, and at least half of those trials don't ever meet their planned recruitment targets. Part of the reason for this is thought to be that healthcare systems are overburdened. Some of the problems with traditional clinical trials is that their methods that they use are unable to deal with the heterogeneity and complexity of modern diseases. And that makes it hard to translate the results into meaningful clinical information. And at the end of the day, clinicians and researchers and the end users of that research are faced with too many persisting unknowns. So this has led to a call for designing trials that are pragmatic as opposed to explanatory. And we'll go through some of the differences between pragmatic and explanatory trials. Explanatory trials are designed to try to confirm or refute a specific hypothesis, whereas pragmatic trials, they are designed for real-world implementation. Explanatory trials measure efficacy, whereas pragmatic trials aim to measure the effectiveness of interventions. Explanatory trials typically have very narrow eligibility requirements, where their outcomes are set to optimize the ability to detect an effect. They often have, because of that, relatively small sample sizes, and they have the potential to overestimate the potential for a benefit and underestimate the potential of harm in an intervention. Pragmatic trials, on the other hand, tend to enroll from broad patient groups, so the entire population. They use an outcome that is clinically important. Because of this, they tend to require larger sample sizes, and they tend to reflect the true benefit and true harm associated with an intervention when that intervention is used in the real world. So We need to be able to evaluate interventions in specific groups of patients. We need to be able to allocate more participants to better interventions. We need to be able to add new interventions when they become available, to be able to drop any interventions that don't improve outcomes. We need to be able to increase or stop recruitment in particular patient subgroups. We need to be able to evaluate multiple treatment options in a more time-efficient way. And we need to be able to learn which treatments are best wherever there is uncertainty. And this need is especially great when there are many uncertainties, and that is especially the case with emergent pandemics of infectious diseases like the COVID-19 pandemic, and our team is supporting a number of adaptive trials which are aiming to find the optimal approach to diagnosing and managing COVID-19. What are adaptive trials? So traditional clinical trials are very fixed. They have a fixed design, fixed treatments, and a high chance of never answering the questions that they set out to answer. Adaptive trials, on the other hand, are flexible. They allow us to change the trial based on how people respond to treatment in the trial. So an adaptive trial is any clinical trial that allows for prospectively planned modifications to one or more aspects of the design based on accumulating data from subjects in the trial. The important thing to note here is that any adaptations need to be prospectively planned. And so this isn't simply a matter of making up the rules as you go along or as your interest takes you. All of the adaptations need to be pre-specified in a protocol. And you can think of the motivation for an adaptive trial being similar to planning your commute to work in the morning. In an adaptive trial, you know your destination, you know where you want to end up, but you don't specify in advance exactly the route that you're going to take. That route may have to change based on prevailing traffic conditions, weather conditions, roadworks, and the like. So an adaptive design allows you to specify where you want to end up, specify the rules which you will apply to determine the route, but then the route that you take can be one of a number of possible routes. So adaptive trials are frequently conceived in terms of this continuous cycle. We have patients who are enrolled, and they may or may not be stratified into various pre-specified subgroups, and then they are randomized. They receive the intervention to which they are assigned, and then at some point in the future we report the outcome for the participant. We record that outcome in usually an electronic data capture system, and we periodically do analyses of that data using a statistical model. And that statistical model typically calculates the probability that one treatment is better than all others, or that one treatment is effective compared to no treatment at all. And if a treatment has a high probability of being the best treatment or of being effective, then we might hit a termination rule. and declare that that treatment is the best treatment and that all patients should start receiving that. Alternatively, the probability that a treatment is best may fall so low that it's no longer reasonable to keep assigning people to that treatment, and so we might reach a termination rule for futility and stop the trial. If a treatment, if we hit a termination rule that a treatment is likely to be best or to be effective, then we might pre-specify that that treatment is either implemented in routine practice, depending on how much other information we have about it, or that treatment might graduate into a more definitive study. If we don't hit a termination rule, then we would plan to continue randomizing, but rather than continuing to randomize in the same way, we could use the information that we have about those treatments to update the randomization to the different treatment arms. And typically what we would do is start to assign treatments proportional to the probability that they are best. So any treatment that appears to be performing well, that will start receiving more of the allocation of future participants, and any treatments that are not performing as well will receive relatively less. And so we use those updated randomization weights to randomize future participants, and again we go around the cycle until we hit a termination rule. The other thing that we can do in an adaptive trial potentially is to add new treatments over time as they become available. And this may be so the adaptive features of an adaptive trial can include these flexible stopping rules to optimize the sample size. It allows us to perform repeat analyses as the data accumulates at each analysis to estimate the probability that a treatment is successful or that it is futile given the current data, and to compare this probability with a pre-specified threshold. And typically a high threshold for declaring it is superior either to the standard of care or superior to all other treatments, or a low probability of superiority as a threshold for dropping that treatment because it's futile. In addition to being able to adapt the total sample size of the study, we can also use another adaptive feature which is called response adaptive randomization. And this is especially helpful when we have multiple treatments that we want to evaluate within a given trial. At each of these interim analyses, we assign a higher proportion of new participants to whichever treatments are best. And so we're assigning them proportional to the probability that the treatment is either the best treatment of the treatments being evaluated or the probability that it's better than the standard of care. The other adaptive features of adaptive trials are the ability to add or drop treatment arms, either adding new treatments as they become available, as they are discovered, but also the ability to drop treatments if they're clearly not best, or if there's evidence accumulating that they may actually be harmful. Another feature of Bayesian trials is the ability to look not just in a single group of patients, but to look how the effect of different treatments work across similar but different patient groups. And so this is the principle of borrowing information across different patient groups to try to work out for each patient group which treatment is best for them. So now we're going to move on to the topic of platform trials. Platform trials can use Bayesian inference, but not necessarily. And the parents of platform trials are the so-called umbrella design and the so-called basket trial design. In an umbrella trial design, we have a specific disease, for example, lung cancer, and we want to test not just a single drug in a clinical trial, but we actually have several different drugs that we want to test, but we want to test all of those drugs against this single disease entity. In a basket trial, on the other hand, we actually have a single drug that we want to test, but we want to test it against a range of different diseases. And classically, this is done in cancer trials where you have a single genetic mutation which is common to a range of different cancers, and that genetic mutation is the target of a specific drug. And rather than running several different trials for each type of cancer, we put all of the cancer patients into a single trial and evaluate that drug against the full range of cancers. A platform trial is a clinical trial which has what's called a single master protocol or a single core protocol in which multiple treatments are evaluated simultaneously. Platform trials have been described as like building a sports arena or a sports stadium. So unlike a traditional clinical trial, which is set up to answer a single question, typically about a single drug and its effectiveness for treating a specific disease, platform trials are like building a sports stadium. You build the infrastructure, but you build it once, and you provide that infrastructure for multiple teams to compete. And in this context, these multiple teams might be the sponsors of specific drugs, and they're all interested to be able to show that their drug is effective against a certain disease or a class of diseases. And rather than build their own sports ground, they all agree to share in the cost of a single stadium. What that also means is that those different treatments can be compared against each other. So they're not just being compared against no treatment or against the standard of care. Everything in theory is being evaluated against everything else. And so here we have the analogy of a participant who receives a patient of a particular type who may receive intervention A, B, C, or D, or E. But we might find for that particular type of patient over time that intervention C is not an optimal one, and that might be dropped relatively early, and then progressively we might find that intervention E is not an effective therapy for that type of patient. For a different type of patient, and we can evaluate against different treatments against different types of patient who may be eligible to receive the different treatments. And progressively show which treatments are best for particular types of patient. So in a platform trial, any number of treatment combinations can be evaluated. Those treatments can be added or removed over time according to pre-specified rules. There can be a range of different subgroups of patient that are evaluated, although the ability to add subgroups does depend to an extent on the size of that subgroup. It's very hard to learn something about patient groups that are very small, as in any trial. There is no maximum sample size in a platform trial. These are typically designed to be perpetual, or at least to continue enrolling participants for as long as there is uncertainty about which treatment is best. We use frequent analyses, so it's not a single analysis at the end of a trial as in a typical design. We have pre-specified or predefined rules that we employ for making the adaptations, and the treatment assignments are controlled by a central statistical model based on accruing participant data. So platform trials are useful when outcomes are available relatively quickly. If outcomes cannot be determined for many years after someone is enrolled, then it makes it difficult for the adaptive processes to improve the efficiency of the design. They're useful whenever there is significant uncertainty about the relative efficacy or rates of adverse events or variability in the patient population. So whenever the conditions cannot be anticipated fully in advance of commencing the study. They're useful when there are multiple treatment options and when there are differences in the potential treatment responses across different groups. They are useful when you anticipate that new therapies will become available over time, and when you're able to secure the buy-in of multiple stakeholders who agree to evaluate their treatments within a single platform. So by way of illustration, I'm going to discuss a platform trial design that we are involved in establishing. This is BCF, and this is a platform trial that is looking to learn the optimal management of exacerbations of cystic fibrosis, where cystic fibrosis is a genetic disease of the lungs that typically results in premature death from respiratory failure. So the way that BCF has been designed is through multiple simulations. So what we do in these simulations is that we create thousands of pretend trials, theoretical trials, and we use those trials to understand the rate of trial success or trial failure under a range of different plausible scenarios. The way that the trial is designed is to ask at each analysis what is the probability that a treatment is best compared to all the other treatments that are being evaluated in the trial. And then we use that information over time to assign more future participants to the better performing treatments and fewer participants to treatments that are clearly not the best. What we can do, and typically we do is we have a burn-in period. So that is a period where we assign the treatments with equal allocation to the various available treatments, and this can be very useful early on. and we can test a range of strategies for implementing the response adaptive randomization, strategies where the response adaptation is relatively aggressive when we want to start assigning people as quickly as possible to the best performing treatments, versus more conservative response adaptive randomization, where we allow the progressive increase in assignment to the best treatments to occur more gradually over the course of the trial. There's no perfect solution to these issues, and really the only way to understand how they will perform in the real world is to perform a lot of simulations before the trial commences. So consider the BCF design, where we have a domain which is a set of mutually exclusive treatment options. In this example, we might have a range of primary antibiotics that we want to compare against each other. But patients having exacerbations of their lung disease with cystic fibrosis, they typically don't just receive a single antibiotic, they might receive in addition an adjunctive antibiotic, and there may be 4 adjunctive antibiotics that we want to compare. But in cystic fibrosis, not everyone is the same. There are patients who do or don't have colonization with Pseudomonas, and there are also those who have good lung function versus those who have low or moderate baseline lung function. And so we want to know for each of these 3 subgroups whether which antibiotic or antibiotic combination is best. And this complicated graph shows what a simulation looks like. And so we have here on the left-hand side a range of simulations simulating the treatment responses of patients in one of 3 subgroups across one of 16 different combinations of antibiotic therapy. And you can see that for every antibiotic that is being evaluated, we have an estimate of the effectiveness of that treatment with a estimate of the confidence or the precision of that treatment effect. And what happens over time is that as we enroll more and more participants and assign them to these different treatments, we get progressively more confident in the effect of the treatment on their airway disease. Here, skipping forward to 1,200 participants, you can see that some treatments are working better than others, and we're getting progressively more certain about the effectiveness of the different treatments. And the other thing that we can see is that down here in the bars are the number of participants in the study who have received the different treatment combinations. And you can see that some treatment combinations are receiving more participants than others, and they're the treatment combinations that are performing the best, whereas some treatment combinations are receiving relatively few participants, and they're the treatment combinations that are not working as well. One of the other features of Bayesian trials is the ability to perform quite detailed subgroup analyses. And what we can do in a subgroup analysis is we can define a range of different types of patient, here represented as these 6 people above. And what we're trying to do is to learn about the treatment response of this person down here. And what we can do is we can set up models that allow us to learn as much about this person's treatment response from those prior participants who are most similar to him and relatively less or potentially nothing at all from previous participants who are the least like him. And the way that that works is using what's called a hierarchical Bayesian model. And what this hierarchical model does is it says that we want to learn about the treatment response in these three different types of patients, type A, type B, and type C. But the treatment response in these different types of patients are different. But they're all in some way related to each other, and that relationship is defined by what we call this multi-level or hierarchical model, where we say that the average treatment responses in the different groups is itself defined by this parameter here, and what we're trying to learn is all four of these things: the overall relationship of the average treatment responses across the groups, and then from that the average treatment response and the confidence around that average treatment response in each of the different types of participants. So some suggestions for how to implement adaptive trials. The important thing is that these things cannot be done overnight or even in a day or a week. These things typically take many weeks and even months to design. Requires a lot of consultation with a group of statisticians and clinicians and trialists, and also with consumers and other stakeholders in order to get the design right. Adaptive designs take longer to design and to develop than traditional clinical trials. So this is the main barrier to their implementation, is the amount of time it takes to design an adaptive trial. Typically we require many simulations in order to understand the operating characteristics of an adaptive trial. Potentially it can be more difficult to get adaptive trials funded, and a lot of work needs to be done to educate scientific review committees and funders and ethics committees about platform and adaptive trials, so that they understand how it is that they work, and hopefully over time will be increasingly supportive of their use. There's always a gap between the trial that you want to do and the trial that you are able to do because of limitations of funding and resources. And adaptive trials are no different. This is where some pilot data can be helpful. Previous barrier to implementation of adaptive trials is that often groups who are reviewing these trials may be skeptical of the use of Bayesian inference and are very often not familiar with new ways of doing clinical trials. So the sorts of concerns that we have come up against when we've proposed these designs are concerns about the use of Bayesian inference as opposed to the more typical frequentist inference that we classically use in most health and medical research, concerns about the adaptive features, especially the misconception that we make the rules up as we go along, and a misunderstanding that in fact all of the adaptive features must be and are pre-specified before we enrol the first participant. The other barrier is the lack of and concerns about the amount of digital infrastructure that's required to implement these studies, concerns about where data sits and the security and the privacy of that data. So review committees typically need to be convinced that this is a safe and secure way of handling participant information. So if you are considering doing an adaptive trial, it may be helpful to utilise an ethics committee that has reviewed adaptive trials before, and where there is some expertise in reviewing and understanding adaptive trials on the committee or on the scientific advisory committee to the ethics committee. And we've often found it useful to consult with review committees before submission. The other thing that can be very useful is to take a stepwise approach to implementing these trials. So typically what we have done is to implement a observational run-in phase, where we're really just implementing the platform, where we're not assigning treatments, but we're just demonstrating that we can capture the treatment and outcome data in a clean and in a timely way. And then once we are confident that the data capture solution and all of our processes are working, that's when we turn on the randomization, and so that's when we're assigning people to specific treatments. Adaptive trials are especially needful of digital solutions. Firstly, the computational and computing power that's required to run the simulations both before the trial is even commenced and in the design phase, but also after the trial is implemented. The actual interim and periodic analyses are very computationally intensive. We need to be able to receive data about participants' treatment and outcome in a timely way in order to do these periodic analyses. And so that typically requires an electronic data capture solution, because traditional paper-based case report forms make it very difficult to receive the data in a timely way to allow these interim analyses. It works especially well if you can embed these trials within routine care, and that is the ultimate aim for a lot of our studies, is to make these adaptive trials just part of the routine care of patients. But all of this takes time. One of the challenges that we have is the lack of experience and expertise to design and implement these trials, and we have established some expertise at the Telethon Kids Institute and the Adaptive Health Intelligence team, but this is something that we're keen to work with other groups so that they can also develop this expertise and hopefully see these methods more widely adopted. And as part of that, the Adaptive Health Intelligence team has developed a lot of resources which are available at this site. So if you have residual questions about adaptive trials, you will find some great resources at this site, including a number of videos and illustrations of some of the concepts that we've discussed today. And there are also a number of videos on YouTube that we have created, and they're available at this site. And finally, our team, the Adaptive Health Intelligence team at Telethon Kids Institute, is very happy to receive emails, questions, ideas about implementing these methods. So please feel free to reach out to us for a no obligation discussion about your ideas. So in summary, efficient trial designs can reduce both the financial and the opportunity costs of running clinical trials. We can use response adaptive randomization. We can use flexible stopping rules and Bayesian borrowing that make trials more efficient for answering questions, especially where there are multiple treatment or therapeutic options. But it does require high-level coordination and governance. It requires expertise in simulation and in Bayesian analysis. It requires significant time and effort for building the best possible design for the question that you have, and it also requires a digital infrastructure to support the. So this is a quick reminder of the upcoming Research Skills seminars on the 22nd of May. Fenella Gill and Tobias Sherp are talking about knowledge translation, and Julie Marsh is talking about Introduction to Biostatistics on the 5th of June.